Wherever you'd like. You all set? Great. Okay, it's a little past 10:45, so let's get started. My name is Mark Roach. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, and delighted to welcome you to this session. I'm especially grateful that the Center for Ethics and Culture has included a session on art, because often one neglects the arts when thinking about issues of ethics and religion. This morning's speaker will be Thomas Gordon Smith. Professor Smith is a renowned architect who has designed private residences, churches, seminaries, monasteries, and museum additions. His work is partly inspired by the insights of Vitruvius, on whom Professor Smith is writing a monograph. Smith's work has led to more than 20 museum exhibits and is the subject of a recent monograph by Richard John entitled Thomas Gordon Smith and the Revival of Classical Architecture. In addition to his creative and scholarly work, Professor Smith led Notre Dame's School of Architecture for a decade and helped bring forth its distinctive reputation in classical education in architecture. Among Professor Smith's interests is the capacity of classical architecture to express Christian values. His topic today is the sacred as reflected in life-giving architecture.
Excuse me, I will move my notes for just 1 minute. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak in this conference. I've been able to attend some of the sessions in the previous years, and it's, of course, a remarkable event. And the sign of more and more people signing up and coming from various places each year is a great testament to its effectiveness and the stimulation of this opportunity. I am going to just take a moment, if I may, to find the right place with the slides. Now, excuse me. I apologize for not having this up. And may I have the lights down, please? This is a remarkable time in architecture, obviously not unique in terms of the past, but the challenges and the distinctions in approaches to the opportunities to build across all types of buildings, and particularly in buildings for the Catholic Church, are remarkably polarized at this time. We are, of course, in the much vaunted 21st century, a century which is really being exploited, I think, in the medium of architecture and publication in terms of reinforcing in the popular press as well as the what's left of the professional press the vindication of modernism as a style or an approach or a mentality of architecture. And I do mean what's left of the professional press if we are in fact the nation that is the richest and the most powerful politically and culturally vital, which in many ways is true even on the cultural side today. We only have one professional architectural magazine left, whereas at least a decade ago there were three. In fact, it doesn't even seem to be enough to have one magazine, because they have curtailed the last several letters of the word architecture, which is the traditional title of this magazine, to call it something like architect. And so this kind of cutting off and cutting up of the word itself of architecture, I think, is a poignant sign of the mentality which is really dominant in our profession and dominant in most of the schools of architecture. I just start with a pair of slides here as an obvious contrast. On the left is a church which has gotten tremendous publicity and focus because it is the church that was commissioned by the Archdiocese of the City of Rome to proclaim the Church of the year 2000. One very strange thing about it, this was awarded to the architect Richard Meyer several years before the turn of the millennium, at least 5 actually. And yet we still, when it's published, see it in model form. I think I need to go out to the suburb area of Rome and see it sometime, but I have never seen a photograph of the actual edifice. We keep seeing it, even though it's now almost 2003, in the form of the architect's pristine model. This is proclaimed constantly as a new and breakthrough building. I'll try to show, however, in this talk how dependent it is on at least 50 years of imagery of modernist architecture that has been developed for Catholic Church. But in a recent article in Time magazine, which some of you may have seen on the 2nd of September, the focus of the article was about the dedication of the new cathedral in Los Angeles. But to bring in, of course, parallel structures, the author did make a reference to Richard Meyer's church in Rome. And I'll just quote from his commentary because I think it's useful to get a sense of what there's an agenda here, but what is being given to the general public. The author says, "It says something about the triumph of modern church design that Richard Meyer, an uncompromising inheritor of the spirit of Mies van der Rohe, was chosen by the Archdiocese of Rome to design the church of the year 2000. So here, of course, it's a significant place. It's actually in a suburb of Rome, but nonetheless being touted and used very much to emphasize how important, how the church, in a sense, a part of a new Vatican statement, it's almost implied here, is that this is the architecture for our time. That's just a supposition. However, to quote the architect talking about this church, he says, "This is a contemporary church," I'm emphasizing, but it's there, "a church that has to capture the spirit of the present times." Now, I'm sure if you are from a philosophical background, or Professor McInerney's talk last night, this modernism, of course, has been with us for well over 100 years, and particularly a product of the last century. The aspects of this church are not new, as they're often given, in the sense that we have had at least 5 decades of modernist post-war architecture, which is at the root of all of the forms. In fact, I was showing the slides to my son before I packed them up in the carousels this morning, and he said, I asked him, "Well, does that look like a church?" And he said, "Oh, no, it looks like the Sydney Opera House." So there's one reference coming from an 11-year-old. The other reference that the author of this Time magazine article makes is to Mies van der Rohe. But the real key here, and we'll focus on this architect, is Le Corbusier, whose work we will see later. And Corbusier's work, and particularly One Church, is really the background and the model or paradigm for all of these buildings. I apologize. On the right, the thing I should be spending time talking about, is a delightful project for a chapel, not unfortunately to be built, but by a young firm in Washington, D.C., Frank Lotion McCreary. And here we see, of course, a rectangular or a square central nave and sanctuary with a tower and a point of entry. Now, the cliche about criticizing modernist architecture is that you cannot find the door when you're approaching it, and I think one can see where the door is in Mr. Meyer's church. However, it is not proclaimed as a grand entry, as we see on this little sketch for a church on the right. We see elements that from the exterior that we can recognize, and all of those elements, such as the columns that support an entablature and pediment at the entry door to say, "Come on in," or the dome that suggests the dome of heaven and floating above the nave and the sanctuary of the building, or the tower that undoubtedly has bells that will give us an oral indicator of the time of Mass, or the fact that this is a church, are all there. Almost none of those are here in Meyer's design, and that's very intentional. Those things are not to be promoted again, because they're time of those bad old days of our great-grandfathers by this point, certainly not our fathers. So we do have a bell tower, obviously, I have to concede that, but that's really about it. Now, a person I think that's certainly been vital to my understanding of architecture and the potential for what an integrated architecture can become was referred to by Mark Roche as Vitruvius, ancient Roman architect who had really spent most of his architectural career as a military engineer with Augustus during the civil wars and the bloody conflicts of that period before Augustus triumphed and began to establish an empire. On the left is a reconstruction of a ballista, which is based on what Vitruvius calls the symmetriae, or the proportional relationships of the different elements of the structure that allow it to function properly as a killing machine and made it an effective aspect in terms of the winning of these wars ultimately. But the point is that Vitruvius's work was primarily, in terms of the vital period of his life, involved in destroying cities, not building them. On the right, our current destruction means that often heads are lopped off in Rome of 19th century sculptures of model personages. So on the right, we see Vitruvio is given by name, but his head is probably in an antique shop in Rome or in someone's private collection at this point. Vitruvius has been a constant source of stimulation and understanding of both the elements of architecture, the physical forms, as well as ideas of architecture. And there have been at least 100 editions since the late 1400s of his work that periodically have come out, half of them sponsored by architects who are interested in how the words and the concepts of this ancient architect who wrote about the time of the birth of Christ can be revitalized and stimulate us to new architectural directions in every time they've been out, and the other half basically philological works more interested in the terminology, the historical context. On the right is, of course, not a Picasso design, but something that sort of takes off from that mentality of distorting elements of the human face, for example, in a painting. Here, just casts that are made for artists to develop their skills in drawing of the different aspects of noses and eyes and so forth of Michelangelo's David, but arranged in a way to make them deconstructed and incomprehensible as a whole form. We think that deconstruction might be something new and exciting, and all of the threats that we currently feel in terms of the world of potential war and terrorism and our own involvement in terrorism in a certain way is something new. I mean, some people might think that. But of course, Vitruvius and everyone at his time knew about body parts strewn over streets and so forth, much like we might see this image on the right. So that a contemporary approach with deconstruction is to interpret that horror and present us with more horror, as we will see in a monument designed by Peter Eisenman for the World Trade Tower, where the horrific event is depicted with greater contortion. Whereas for Vitruvius and many people who have followed him, the response to this horror, this inevitable messiness of the world and horror of the world, is to try to bring things together, to integrate them, to achieve a perfection and certainly a wholeness, even though he might, or we certainly as Christians would readily assent that that perfection is impossible for us to achieve. We still try if we're following a Vitruvian line. So the illustration on the left is of his ideal form of a temple, borrowed from the Hellenistic Greeks, a Ionic prostylos, eustylos, the good columned building, as a temple with a little portico. And then he makes a very strong point, and one that's been illustrated by Leonardo in that great image of the man, is that is a reflection. There's a correspondence between the ideal proportions in the human form and those in architecture. So these are images which have been important ones, resurrected and revived many times, constantly really in a cyclical way, whereas for the last 50 years at least, this has been absolutely forbidden as a model to be taken seriously in schools of architecture or in practice. On the left and the right are two images that illustrate the central aspects of Vitruvius's thought that pertain to whether an architect really can permit himself or herself to emulate, to copy and imitate models of their forefathers. And these would be called by Vitruvius decor. So that's a familiar word to everybody in terms of its relationship perhaps to decorous behavior, almost an etiquette. And in this concept, this is the concept, I won't go into this too much right now, but that I believe separates the modernist from the classical or traditional architect. Many of Vitruvius's concepts and methods are naturally practiced by an architect no matter what kind of architecture they do. But the issue of decor really kind of draws the line or forces one to cross a threshold or not, because it deals implicitly with the idea of imitation of models and with kind of accepting the idea that there are things that have been established as rules which at least within a certain aspect of consideration are canonical. And there's no reason that those canons cannot be changed or manipulated, developed, but as a learning exercise and as a constant point of reference, they are rules that have a rationality. They have been built up over hundreds of years by the Greeks and then by the Romans, and reinvested by Palladio and other architects in the Renaissance and Borromini in the Baroque period, so-called Baroque. And that those things are canons that are of importance. This is a violation of the first rule of modernism, which is thou shalt not imitate anything that has existed before. On the right is a picture of Ionic architecture and the elements of architecture and their proportions according to Vitruvius. And he uses, this is one way that we can look at his concept of decor of custom, which is basically an idea that the Ionic is a family of architecture that has developed over time in Ionia, and that it contains various elements which are part of that family, part of the genes, you might say, so that we're all familiar with the column capitals, with the volutes, as being an essential part, a good identifier for Ionic. We may be familiar with the base on the right of this picture, on the lower right, which is specifically an Ionic type of base. And maybe another signal for this architecture would be the dentils, the things at the top below the cornice of the structure that look like teeth, dentils. So that those are elements that are appropriate to this type of architecture. And Vitruvius says, admonishes us, dentils are Ionic. If I see a dentil on your Doric entablature, you're going to get an F. Okay? That's wrong, because it is not part of the family or the language of Doric architecture. People did it anyway. But the point is that there was this set of rules that is established by the decor of custom. And so to throw that in the face of a modernist architect who's been trained in this way and say this is a valid concept, of course it's totally invalid from that point of view from the beginning, because, well, you shouldn't even think of using Ionic architecture to building in the first place. Let's forget about all those details of dentils or bases or capitals. The other aspect of decor of canon is illustrated on the left, which in one sense is a relationship that has to do with iconography, or the meaning, the potential for architecture to be a conveyor of meaning. And architecture, of course, is a rather mute art compared to sculpture or painting. That's why in the old days there were such wonderful examples of the integration of the sculptor's work and the painter's work within a piece of architecture, because one could be far more articulate in terms of an iconographic program of meaning. However, at an abstract level, the decor of canon allows us to think of Doric columns, say in the central part where the man is standing within the portal, as being a heavy architecture that is associated with a certain masculine quality, perhaps, although Vitruvius also says that Athena is represented through Doric, so it's not a gender-specific only, but it's a matter of character. Athena, with her toughness and so forth, is associated with the Doric, as well as perhaps someone like Hercules. Athena was a lot smarter than Hercules, but this architecture can convey the characters. And of course, Vitruvius is talking about this in relationship to the dedication of a temple to these deities and the appropriate choice of a signal or a symbol on the exterior entranceway, for example. By the time we get up to the top, we have these very elaborate and slender and refined and beautiful types of architecture that have their own systems of entablatures and so forth, post and beam construction essentially. And then this is exclusively dedicated to the more delicate female type, even as opposed to the matronly type that might be associated with Ionic. So here are two concepts that would be verboten for the modernist, just because, this is irrelevant today. There is no reason for this. Now, Vitruvius is the only ancient architectural writing that has come down to our times. Fortunately, he gathered a great deal of information from Hellenistic writers before those were somehow lost, and so we have him to transmit that. But as I said before, his work has been available not only in the Renaissance time and later, but also throughout the Middle Ages. In fact, that's the reason we have him at all, through probably Carolingian manuscripts copying his text. And so we can say not only that Vitruvius has been relevant to classical architects of the Italian Renaissance and other later developments of that, but also in through the Romanesque, we might call it the Middle Age period, and even to Gothic, that even though they weren't interested in the specific ratios or symmetry of his proportions or the specific elements of his architecture that he describes, at least in terms of his classical vision of them, they were very provoking works and had a relevance. Say, if on the right, just to talk about a few styles, we have a good illustration of two coming up together with the dome of Michelangelo's rising up in the 1550s above the still remaining facade of St. Peter's in Rome, of the old Constantinian church. So we've got early Christian and Renaissance as two styles, if I can use that term, represented here. And of course, a great example, rather romantic version of the Cathedral of Strasbourg of a late, particularly refined Gothic type. Now, the motivation and relevance for Vitruvius certainly survived in this country and in Europe through the years just before the Second World War. On the right, we see a church which was very proudly built during the early years of the Depression in Chicago, Our Lady of Peace, dedicated in 1933. In the south side of Chicago, a building which I don't think was a very self-conscious structure, a very conscious architect, but not a self-conscious choice of the terminology, the architectural elements, basically derived from very early 1500s Roman architecture, Bramante, and that Italian tradition, somewhat different tradition in the bell tower in the back, perhaps more of a Romanesque element. But a building which is very strong, very proud, and still an extremely vital parish on Jeffrey Street in the south side of Chicago. Now, at the same time that architect was building in Chicago, or others were building in Europe and so forth, buildings somewhat similar, and certainly holding on to Vitruvian ideals and other ideals and following models in a very obvious way, and a great positive feeling of what a church should and could be in proclaiming its place, we have the concurrent development of modernism, as it's often called, or modernist architecture. It's being revised now. On the left, just a standard icon for that of Le Corbusier, Swiss-French architect, who built a villa, not a church here, at Poissy near Paris, the Villa Savoie in the late 20s. So these are roughly contemporaneous buildings, certainly being designed at the same period of time. And if I may read from just the introduction to the first English translation of Corbusier's famous book, Vers une architecture, which he wrote in the 1920s, about the same time he's designing Villa Savoie. This is a propaganda book, you might say, in terms of the publication in London, with the introduction. So I'm not here reading from Corbusier's kind of bombastic prose, but in fact, the more considered prose, let's say, from the person writing the introduction who had made the translation. 1931 here in London. The average architect of today, when Monsieur Le Corbusier would tell us, is a timid and poor-spirited creature, afraid to look facts in the face. Oh, isn't that great? Sort of this John Wayne attitude, facts in the face. He plays his little tricks, so he's effeminate, he's childish. He plays his little tricks with this or that historic style, in quotes. And he can turn his attention into order like you might in a automat, from Gothic to classical to Tudor to Byzantine or whatnot. So what? By concentrating his training so largely on these superficial aspects, Le Corbusier would say all styles become equally available to the architect for exploitation. Not so, he would say, is great or even good architecture produced. But it will be said, we cannot escape the past or ignore the pit from which we were hewn. All right. So, obviously, terribly vindictive and negative attitude. And it's amazing how the same kind of word is used over and over again in schools for now, 70 years, to discourage students who might come in and say, as our current chairman of the School of Architecture started as a freshman at Cornell, I think it was, and said, I want to make beautiful architecture. And in the midst of all the new freshmen, the faculty started pointing its fingers and saying, that's not what we do as architects. That's not a good criterion. This is what you should do instead. So this brainwashing, like we see there, continues. Now, the big breakthrough for modernist architecture in terms of the Catholic Church is this building, which also is more than an icon. It's an absolute essential in terms of the reverence, built after the Second World War, Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp in the southeastern part of France. And here a famous iconic photograph of the building from the 1950s. This was started in the late 40s and finished in 54. A building which certainly, as sculpture and architecture and so forth, has, in a certain way, if one tries to gain some perspective, is a major architectural, sculptural achievement, certainly within the context of modernist artwork. And on the right, or excuse me, on the left, we see a view of the building seen from omnipotently, as God would see it if he were able to pull off the roof. And we see the interior. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is it's not only a matter in terms of modernist architectural thought and kind of discussion to say, oh, we don't have columns anymore, we don't have domes, those things are irrelevant. Instead, we have, all of these forms, such as we see in this example. But the primary word that's used, there are two really, but the primary one is space. Space. We are in a space. We're not in an auditorium. We are in a space. And if we go into a church that might look like this, and as you know, many of them do, then we are in a sacred space. Somehow that makes it even more scintillating. But this word space has just, it's spacey. It's amazing how much it's used and with what reverence it's used. There are no words like nave or sanctuary in almost all cases. The other thing is light. 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 I heard that so many times as a student at Berkeley, and thank goodness I could ignore it, but it's just, it's just unbelievable. Space and light, these intangible things, which are wonderful. There's no question. But we don't talk about things in these abstract, intangible terms. We talk about them, we strive to talk about them as articulately as possible by using vocabulary. And of course, that vocabulary then forces us back to the Renaissance or back to Vitruvius to talk about things that these old dead people invented as words and as concepts. But you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to reinvent all of the vocabulary. Now, the one thing that wouldn't have entered Corbusier's mind as he designed Ronchamp would be that his forms that are so sinuous and so forth and bold would come from much more than his mind. Maybe a few references, very abstract ones, to Greek Parthenons or to Cistercian monasteries, but not the Baroque. Not the Baroque. That's really a no-no. And still a no-no, unfortunately. It's one of the great negative pressures we have today. But one thing that's interesting, since the postmodern years of the 1970s, there has been the introduction into law-abiding modernists of admiration for a building like the one on the right. A little tiny chapel in Rome called San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, one of the great buildings of the world, from starting in the early 1600s, 1630, and finally finished in terms of facade in the 1670s, at about the time of Borromini's death. The point is here that an architect like Richard Meyer on the left can talk about how wonderful, how he's been inspired by Borromini. So we see the curves, of course, and we see on the right remarkable interior, very rational actually when you begin to analyze it and see what the elements are, how they're relating. But one of our graduate students heard Mr. Meyer speaking in Rome a couple of years ago, promoting the church, and Meyer was talking all the way through the talk about how his building, showing slides of his building, were in the context of Rome, and you couldn't build a church in Rome without following that context. And our student, who's Italian, Carmine, said afterward, well, Mr. Meyer, I just don't see it. You talked about all these links, but I don't see them. And evidently, sweat just started pouring out of his forehead. And I mean, this is one cool multimillionaire architect. And he got all agitated and he said, well, it's the space. I mean, this word again, it keeps coming up. And you're talking about how you can, relate to Rome, and then all you can talk about is space, because there's a total denial of the vocabulary, the structure, the grammar, and syntax of this architecture. Well, we see this, and I want to be sure to rush through so we can look at some things that are the antidote. The cathedral in Los Angeles is the same tradition, the reliance on Corbusier. It's interesting, in the periodicals, nothing is talked about Corbusier as a background or a mentor for this. But we see in the Tulsa paper here, the diocesan paper on the left, the dedication and the great space, sacred space. And on the right, one thing I just want to read is from the same article in Time magazine from early September. The writer says, quote, "A sign of the cleansing operation of modern architecture has been embraced for one of the most ambitious places of Catholic worship in the new century." So we're also still getting this word about how clean it is, how squeaky it is, and of course cleanliness is good, and the other stuff is kind of dirty, so we want to go this way. And Moneo himself, if you look at that picture on the left, uses this sacred word again. He's quoted as saying he wanted to offer a space where people could feel more able to isolate themselves from daily life. All right, this is the function of a cathedral. We are somehow going to just become little hermits and not bring our faith out into the world. It's just quite unbelievable, but, and maybe there are other quotes which are better, but nonetheless, this is the mentality that we have to use buildings like this to get away from the freeway and so forth, which is another part of the article. Here, a detail of the Virgin Mary on the right, who is doing this really nifty thing of having a halo, which is actually a void in the canopy as you enter the church. Isn't that neat? is shown, and just as a comparison, the marvelous interactive and really integrated sculpture at San Carlo Le Quattro Fontane from the architect Borromini. Now, the other thing that the author says in this Time article about the Los Angeles Cathedral is the architect, I'm sorry I didn't mention, Jose Rafael Moneo. Moneo's additional aim was to provide the Los Angeles community with a sense of monastic enclosure. Okay, let's look at a contemporary monastery then being proposed in Czechoslovakia, and you may have heard a interesting interview with this architect a couple of weeks ago on NPR about this church. I have to give a lot of credit in the sense that the terminology that we can see in the plan and the arrangement of the plan is very traditional in terms of the orientations for a Benedictine or Cistercian church, and the terminology for the church actually calls a nave. It isn't sacred space, thank goodness. But on the right, we have, on the left, a photograph of the model for this monastery, and it's kind of amazing. I'm sorry, I just want to find this quote where the architect's work is described in this article. I'll just paraphrase it. I'm sorry. He's talked about a ruthless, John Pawson is his name, a architect who ruthlessly eliminates unnecessary things from architecture. Okay, and then we look at this cloister, and we sort of wonder, well, how is that vault supported? I don't see any columns there to take the weight of the vault or the architrave that goes around the whole cloister. Well, of course, the answer is with modern technology, we can solve any problem like that simply by cantilevering it from above. But, of course, what does this answer in terms of our need as human beings for stasis and a sense of stasis? Whether we can do that or not is really not the point. Last thing about this monastery is we see from the outside the apse of the church, and he described in this interview on NPR how he uses the actual apse itself to have the stairs trailing down, and it's so important for these monks at the time that one dies to carry the casket out that the place for the tabernacle, he didn't put it that way, is actually substituted with a stair and a void, so they can easily, for efficiency, get the casket out and into the adjacent cemetery. Now, if we get a little more parochial, we've been looking at all these highfalutin things, but we go to Chicago with the old St. Mary's Church, which has been now moved out of the loop south on Michigan to an area which is a good idea, newly gentrifying area in the south Michigan area around the street. And so we, again, in this more parochial venture, see Corbusier still with us. This is just dedicated recently. The entry door is student or point entry to sort you, I think, in terms of the what's on the side. And the small font, and also probably well used as a holy water font, is a recreation of Corbusier's Ronchamp. Definitely in there. I'm sorry. The interior is equally kind of disorienting. Sacred space, the priest, the end of the mass space. So there's the word again. On the left, however, we'll start to look at some things which are intended to be an antidote or a counter to this mentality. A church by Michael Ember, an architect from Texas, who designed Thomas Aquinas College, one of 3 competition entries for the interior of the church for their chapel. And here we can clearly see it's very much dependent and interacting with the Romanesque and basilical tradition of architecture, also with a tradition of mosaics and iconography in the area, the triumphal arch and the apse over the altar and sanctuary, as well as the use of elements like trusses and so forth, and a very definable architectural volume, which we could articulately call a nave, crossing, and an apse for the sanctuary. This opportunity, in a sense, to open up to this kind of reuse of vocabulary started in the 1970s. On the right, we see a kind of an iconic building for this approach in Michael Graves' library for the town of San Juan Capistrano. But much more articulate kind of growth from that on the left of a building in Portugal by José de Silva, an architect who's very much engaged in the potential for introduction of classical elements and traditional orientation in churches. That aspect in the United States of looking for different methods of expression, if you will, occupies a number of different niches in terms of the vocabulary which is drawn for new churches. Two examples here for the Southwest, often a natural association with traditional Hispanic architecture. On the left, a church for a new college by Michael Ember, again from Texas, in Corpus Christi. Or on the right, by Duncan Stroik, a member of our faculty here at Notre Dame, for a church in Arizona. A other style is the Gothic, obviously, associated with the development of Christian architecture. These two examples, rather timid and unlearned, I would have to say, but still heading in the right direction. Interesting because they come out of rather large, typical corporate offices as opposed to these vanguard type of architects who are, of course, the leaders of a movement. On the left, really, I think we have to give this design to Mother, I need some help, Mother Angelica, pardon me, that's a terrible sin. Her new monastery here, and of course the great fracas she developed with the Bishop of Los Angeles, being interesting that they were both building monumental structures at the same time and very much at odds with each other in terms of let's just even say the artistic mentality by which that could support a liturgy and a theology. But a building which is not a great building. I think, the intentions are wonderful, the materials are sumptuous, and it's a stable, substantial building and certainly a herald in the right direction, but it's not done with a deep understanding for the language. And I think to a certain degree, maybe better on the right, a Gothic type building in Massachusetts, which again is in the right direction, but it is not a radical interpretation of what might be done with the source material. Certainly more radical and more intellectually deep would be two projects here, again, very much even more so in the Gothic idiom on the left. A student, both undergraduate and graduate, I'm proud to say, at Notre Dame, Duncan McCallum McRoberts, a project for a small chapel and a baptistry in Washington State, or an English architect, Anthony De La Rue, on the right, for a small Herefordshire parish in England. So getting a sense of the geographic diversity of Catholic architects who are interested in exploring these models and developing with the support of parishes. The classical idiom, maybe the grandest of these all, although that could be debated with Gothic, of course, but the point is one that many of these architects have come to get involved with the languages of architecture through classicism, but it tends to be a type which doesn't settle well or is not espoused by the public, which is interesting, whereas more medieval styles, and I find particularly Romanesque is one that resonates in people's minds with what the model or paradigm should be. But these two rotunda-type churches, by on the left the Frank Lowson McCreary firm, is a hypothetical design commissioned by Francis Mannion for a church for the millennium, and is a building that's been very effectively integrated the capabilities of computer simulation to be able to do a fly through this space. Or on the right, a more traditional rendering by Duncan Stroik of another smaller family chapel, in this case, that has many of the same classical elements, including the dome over the center and the clear focus on the tabernacle and the crucifix and altar. I'd like to show a few projects that I've been involved with as an architect. One, a seminary for the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, located near Lincoln, Nebraska. And so far, this has been built in the first phase, which basically is the U shape around the cloister, missing one arm that would be on the upper part of the plan. And we have not been able to build, although hope to fairly soon, the chapel seen on the right. A view on the right of the first phase as completed, and the entryway to the offices and administrative and classroom wing of this structure. This is a building that was requested to be Romanesque, in fact, and by the clientele, and yet in developing the scheme with the clients, obviously a monastic idea was followed here, but also we sort of discovered or became aware that there was no building type in the Romanesque tradition itself for a seminary kind of building. So in any case, everything is a synthesis of many points of reference and models. Here on the left, an interior of the refectory, and on the right, looking out toward the south of the same room, is a model that may be, I mean, certainly I would recognize as being more from the Palladian tradition of interiors of the great villas of Palladio. So the idea is that not in reviving concepts of architectural models do we restrict ourselves to try to duplicate one thing of the past. The world is there full of glory, of richness and variety, and it's not a matter of just being on the smorgasbord and picking it up, but trying a difficult process of synthesis with an eclectic method nonetheless. This a somewhat similar project, but for a group of Benedictines in, Oklahoma near Tulsa, a group of Benedictine monks who have been formed at Fontainebleau in central France, and for the Americans among them for 25 or 30 years wanting to found a new monastery in the United States. The monastery, the mother house, is very much a very strong point of reference, both in terms of functions and relationships. However, the development of the architectural vocabulary is from there and other French Romanesque monasteries, but again with a very strong kind of synthesis of a variety of elements, an extremely rigorous client, the sub-prior of this particular foundation. On the left, a drawing of the columns in the nave of this building, and just a acknowledgement that there's a reference in those Romanesque columns, which come from Fontenay, but reference back to Vitruvius and Greek architecture in terms of the Corinthian type of architecture that we see on the right side. I'll just end with the three projects that were in competition for the chapel at Thomas Aquinas College in California. And this was a very unique opportunity, which I was invited to, Duncan Strike and Michael Ember, and all three of us knew each other and knew each other's work, and I think we all felt, well, we want to win this project, we want to be able to build this building, but if we don't, we know that it's going to be a wonderful building, because there was a very, I'd say, if I may, wise selection of architects who are very commensurate, or their work was in the same vein. So it was a matter of the judgment, I presume, was one of nuance as opposed to Frank Gehry versus Duncan Strike. Here are the renderings which were requested by Michael Ember. Elevation on the right, of course, in this absolutely magnificent setting of Santa Paula, California. Really an ideal paradise-like place with a great college, and development of a very strong Romanesque type of architecture that would be appropriate to the pre-existing buildings on the campus, and in fact a development of the style which had been developed over the years there at the campus. And on the left, really a magnificent perspective of the structure with a view out toward a tower up the hill from the rear of the church. My scheme was drawn more from Spanish architecture in Mexico, and I was intrigued by this type of church with the great apse, almost like the Belvedere at the Vatican, in terms of an exterior facade, which was made void through the apse as a point of entry in this case. And on the left, the aerial view, showing a very traditional development of the apse and a basilical type of arrangement in the volumes. And finally, the winner is Duncan Strike. And Duncan's project is being developed in working drawings now for construction quite soon at Thomas Aquinas. And his scheme, one might say, is more of an Italian type of idiom of architecture. Although within all of these schemes, there are many different blends, you might say, of infusions of traditions, which are roughly Mediterranean and Hispanic, but then cultivated through the analysis of the architects themselves. So this is a very exciting project. I don't know once it's completed if it will get frontline coverage in Time Magazine of the 2004, but let's hope so. It would be a wonderful thing to have this work of Duncan's and the work that's being done around the world by other people to be developed and proclaimed as an exciting new development of modern architecture, which has a cleansing effect. Let's just say that. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions, and I'll, right here.
A comment and then a question.
Yes.
One of the things I've always thought about CAA, purpose over here not, is that, first of all, its architecture is excessively Cartesian. And I think one of the reasons is that I think his view of the human person is Hobbesian, in the sense that I think he buys this, he explicitly read Hobbes, he buys in the notion of the way Hobbes kind of reduces us to war all against wall. And so the architecture is a way in which to kind of keep what he thinks would be the chaos at bay, if indeed human beings allow to kind of these patches. So this absence of decoration and everything else is just a way in which, again, to kind of organize what I think he sees as really a problem with human nature. That's my comment. And then the question is, if any, has Christian Norbert Schultz influenced the way in which you think about architecture?
Oh, very much so. I was very fortunate in 1980 to have a year at the American Academy of Rome, and Norbert Schultz was in residence elsewhere in Rome at the time, and I remember the excitement of first learning what the word spolia meant in his presence. He is a remarkable person, of course, in terms of. This is a Norwegian architectural historian who was trained also as an architect but didn't really practice, and wrote a number of very remarkable and influential books that were very central to the so-called postmodern phase of breaking away from the strictures of modernism, and yet still having a tentative idea of fully engaging within languages or elements. The one thing, Norbert Schultz and many other people were just vital in terms of stimulation and excitement and criticism and pushing forward. The one thing I'm afraid is sad about Christian, from my point of view, okay, so this is a very personal comment, is that late in his life he came to regret the influence that he had, and I'm not saying just to me, but the whole panoply of the people we've just been looking at, the movement, as small but fierce as it is, of people who were rejecting the modernism and saying, let's fully engage. And he has said, he did not say this to me, but it's very clear that why did I write those things if this is what it would lead to? And it's a sad thing to me because, it brings up the issue that, why not let all of these flowers bloom if you want to look at it that way? But he had deep regrets, evidently, at the end of his life. Which seems odd, but we all take the stimulation of our teachers in different ways, and sometimes our teachers might be sorry, I didn't mean it that way, but that's the wonder of life, I guess. Yes, please.
I have a question about how much of the problem on architecture is using a lot of language.
Excuse me, can you go to the microphone? Do you mind?
Going to the microphone?
Yeah, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
wondering about how much of your concern with modern architecture is about the loss of language. I know you talked about the language of architecture and the loss of trying to say something. What I mean is, you talked about light and space. And of course, Gothic cathedrals were obsessed with light and space, but the light and space had a purpose.
Mhm.
And then I look at something like St. John's University, which is in modern, I'm not an architect, so maybe this isn't really considered modern, but Bauhaus architecture. Yet that particular architecture seems to reflect the view of those particular monks, their view of life and utility and none of the frills. And so I'm wondering if part of it is that we don't know what we want to say anymore.
Yeah, I think that the monastic issue is really interesting because there are Corbusier himself loved the Cistercian architecture. And his reading of the Cistercian architecture was not religious at all. It was an atheist. But it was, there was a spirit to it in his terminology or thought. And also, it was this extremely simple and intentionally so architecture devoid of ornamentation. And so that was a paradigm in the loosest possible sense. In fact, he designed a very famous monastery in France, which was the key to St. John's and many others. So we come back to Corbusier. And, so that issue of the Spartan simplicity, of the rigor and the lack of frills, let's say, is central. And yet, if you take it with a approach that like the John Pawson example, which is obviously in this tradition of brutal simplicity. In fact, the word brutalism is a term, as a positive term in the 1950s and 60s for architecture. Brutalism is great. Okay. So you say a neo-brutalist building in that new monastery that we saw with the third act is, that satisfies the monks, and they should publish this interview on NPR. It's a very interesting thing to listen to and analyze what the motivations are. Okay. But I think to answer your question, the point is that yes, all of that is within the Cistercian tradition, but then you go ahead and you devoid the apse of its continuation from the altar to a small altar for the tabernacle, for example, or whatever within the liturgical arguments you finally put there, and you make it a place for exiting this life. Then that's, to me, that really, I hope this responds to your question, because I don't know why the monks tolerated that. And it would be I'm sure we'll have a monograph on this building, so we can maybe, if it's can, find out. But that interaction or the discussions that led to that devaluation of the apse in terms of merely a place to exit life, I find it so shocking. Yes, please, I'm sorry.
What influence, pro or con, does the Vatican have in monumental basilicas, or is there an architectural commission that the Vatican sends out, or is there an architectural commission that is to be called upon to give some structure or framework to the whole process of developing these buildings?
That would have been done by San Carlo Borromeo. It was done by San Carlo Borromeo. So in the mentality of the Counter-Reformation, that exact thing that you're talking about was virtually done. Now, things are too ambivalent. We can't say what something should look like, or we cannot make those pronouncements, partially because, from my observation, this is not an official statement, so please take this just as a totally inculpate statement. The people I have met at conferences in Rome and so forth are still history to modernism in general. And so that would be one aspect of this modernist mentality of what a building should look like is still dominant. Now, but there is no official agency that is going to pronounce from the Vatican. However, those are people who have had and continue. So we get buildings in Rome to celebrate the millennium, like Richard Meyer's building. And in that, the choice of the architect ultimately was also extremely political, because they wanted to make through the selection of their architect the idea that Jews were not excluded. Like they say it that way. And so, in fact, on one of the major Catholic papers, Jewish architect wins building competition. I mean, that becomes, in a sense, a criterion which overrides other aspects maybe, or is certainly part of the whole mix. And the whole West Park is not a highly visual culture person. So then, as far as the absolute direction from his pinnacle is not coming. So again, excuse me, I'm probably not enough time to really discuss it, but sounding crude. But the point is, I don't know. There is no consensus, no sense of direction in this regard.
Thomas, someone's
Yes,
been
please.
waiting for the bell.
Oh, excuse me.
I have a specific question about that abstract word light, but a lot of theologians have been talking lately about recovering eastward orientation, to be redundant about that. But
Okay.
Is there a movement to make churches oriented again and to use light? I'm thinking about an Orthodox chapel I saw in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, in which, behind the sanctuary was a great sort of stained glass collection, so that we recover that natural symbolism of walking as the people to the sun, SU and SO. Are there different options for that?
Yes, here light, of course, is we're talking about the good light rather than the nebulous light. So yes, there is. Again, it's not something that's been decreed by anybody, but there is a real interest in that orientation in not only the tradition, but also, as you're saying, the sun's coming up, Christ will come again from the east, and that is very coming. It's not universal, it's not, the dominant theory or feeling, but that's a great sign. And that's coming from the patron, not from the architect necessarily imposing. Please.
Can you give us a short list of some of the renovation projects that have gone well or not gone well? One that may nudge you in a certain direction is what happened in Milwaukee with the
Okay, I'll start with Milwaukee, and I'll try to then get to positive faster than I did with the slides. Milwaukee is such a great thing. It's unbelievable. It's being acknowledged. Does everybody know Milwaukee, what that word means? The renovation of a basilical church, probably from the 1920s, maybe 30s. Not a great building, but a good basilical church. And Bishop Wicklund, was hell-bent, if I may use that word, before he left, even before he prematurely left, to renovate that building, as they say. And what he did was to remove a very substantial baldacchino and bring the altar forward, all the stuff that you've seen here in parishes. The point I'd like to make about that is, of course, it also is being touted as the great move, vitality. It makes the New York Times and so forth. Well, I knew what they were doing there. And then I went home to El Cerrito, California, near Berkeley, to my little modest parish there, where Gail Bree goes, and everybody in the community goes there. It's nothing special in terms of artistic vision or anything. Exactly. All the moves that were being done in Milwaukee are being done in this little parish, St. John's Parish. And the point is, from this, little kind of sad place where they sing all that music, and then the great highly touted, it's the same moves. And so we were getting this, publicity and this push as though there's great heroic, you could probably quote from Corbusier, this manliness being done in something like Milwaukee, and it's ordinary. There's nothing special about it. Now, what renovations are good? Certainly they're far outnumbered by the bad, but I think that there are parish priests who are coming and people in their communities who are coming forward and saying, we have a building we value, we want to reinforce it, there are things we need to do liturgically or even architecturally or to emphasize things that are potentially better. And that's happening. So it is an opportunity for some of the architects I showed. I did not show anything with renovation, as you're saying here. But anyway, it's a hard struggle, though. And the point, too, as I was saying to someone yesterday, that we can feel good and hopeful. I guess it's, many parallels to our struggles in our spiritual lives. But we can feel hopeful for signs and moving in the right direction. But we're going to, certainly at the time I die, this modernism is going to still be pervasive. We are not going to have a revolution, a change architecture, other than Notre Dame and maybe the University of Miami, is based on the reinforcement of all of these things that the freshman stands up and says, I want to do beautiful buildings, and the teacher says, get out of here or conform with us. This humiliation and technique is absolutely pervasive in schools. And so there are many true believers being formed, like the Dragon's Teeth. So it's not a very happy prospect unless we get some leadership from the Vatican and other places. Now, it'll be very interesting to see what happens. I hope I'm wrong about at least what I can see. And obviously, I'm not a negative person. I'm very optimistic and have these wonderful opportunities. But it seems still like such a, not only the popular press and the mass culture, but in the overall scheme of things, such a small movement. So nice. Please.
Thomas, thank you for that stimulating presentation. I noticed so many of the parishes or the churches built since the council are in the round or this fan shape, anything but having the congregation all facing forward. And I hear liturgists, saying that the old way was wrong, and to be good liturgy, we have to face each other. And so, could you speak to that and to the more general issue of, is there a tension between what classical architects like you want to do with churches, liturgical spaces, and what the liturgists want? Is there a tension there?
Well, it just depends on the architect and the liturgist. So I mean, it obviously does, but I mean, there is this fascination with the field of liturgy, and in very general terms, they are not trained as architects, and have had this tremendous opportunity to, so that the architect becomes a technician who implements the idea and the vision. So that's something for all architects. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be, given the same general orientation and desires for the result, a collaboration that would be very positive. But we've in New York City, all these multimillionaires, they don't go hire an architect first. I mean, this is a cultural problem. It isn't a church problem. They go out to the interior decorator, which is essentially the liturgist. And it's true. And that decorator then moves things, and the architect is sort of a minion who comes along. So that's a professional bias, obviously. But I think you mentioned the church in the round, and there's always been this tension, as it's especially emphasized in architectural history, for example, of the centralized church as an ideal versus the longitudinal basilical type of church. But historically, if you counted them up, the weight would be vastly on the side of the the longitudinal format. But partially too, I think one big influence has come in terms of the accommodation to larger numbers of people, the insistence of kind of communication, observation, hearing, and so forth. That's been a big push since Vatican II in terms of the way Vatican II was interpreted with an agenda, I believe, in order to push for an auditorium type of arrangement that you're referring to. And that there were ready models in terms of the auditorium type church for the 19th century in Protestant structures. So it's a big issue, and there are better people than me to talk about it, I think. But nonetheless, there have been all of these pressures, but there is a void between 2 points of view, and what the ultimate tension is will vary very much. But I think this move toward this was spoken of in terms of the light and the Eastern orientation, but the people facing in a direction and not chatting and talking to each other, winking or whatever, in the kind of more auditorium or church.
Well, and I noticed in the picture you showed of the church for Thomas Aquinas College, very long nave with everybody facing the same direction, totally at variance with what I hear in the liturgy.
Yeah.
They wouldn't like that at all.
Well, I think that's true. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about how you have both, in essence, how you have both classical and new, because it seems like the driving force of modernism is to have something new, or postmodern, to have something new, and break the tradition, and break from all of that. And it seems like, that drive for something new is not bad in itself. And how, I understand the desire to have lots of structure and meaning and to use that language, but how do you, at the same time, use those languages and make something new? Or is it even a concern?
Well, I think it's not a concern that I worry about. It's just I got over worrying about that about 15 years ago, thank goodness. Because I began to develop, and I'm sorry, this will sound very pretentious, but I'll use these terms in terms of my own experience of growth. What Vitruvius calls in another context auctoritas. And for him, authority is not a position of authoritarian beliefs, but gaining a sense of self-confidence because you have learned through your study of the field and your experience in the field by both intellectually studying it and manually practicing it to balance those and then to be able to, understand things. It's not that it isn't a struggle still, but you've got it. You're there in terms of your journey better. And that issue of authority, having confidence within these languages of architecture, then the issue of whether it's new or not becomes irrelevant. You are a living, breathing person. You are responding to clients who have asked you to actually do this. No client is going to spend several $1 million to build what you impose upon them. And so they want it from both sides of the picture, whether it's the modernist agenda or the classical agenda. And so the issue of whether it's new or not, of course, it's intrinsically new because it is of this time. And also, the modernist always says, and they've been saying since 31 and before, those styles are just superficial and you're just picking up, a bag of items from the supermarket and then putting them together through formulae. Well, there's no way. Every time you take one of those items and you try to apply it to a specific situation, there are going to be inherent contradictions. Even the contradiction of air conditioning and mechanical, which no one had in the Renaissance period, for example, brings us to constant challenge of changing those rules and adapting and so forth. So that's the reason I say it's not really an issue once you gain confidence. While you're in anxiety, I was certainly in plenty of anxiety during the 70s because you were going against what every dictum your architectural parents had told you to do. It was terrible. I was very lucky, just personally, again, totally personally, to have a mentor who was a modernist architect in San Francisco who said, it's okay to use those columns. Okay, that's a liberating moment. So, anyway.
Ross, can I sneak in a parallel question? One of the comments you made about modernism is the motto, thou shalt not imitate. And thou shalt not imitate. And clearly your description of modernist architecture suggested that implicitly they are very mimetic. They are, in a sense, imitating the chaos, disorientation, lack of balance that many people sense in the age. And they feel, in creating those artifices, that they're facing the facts, whereas you're not. Now, I see it as a contradiction on their part because they're trying not to be derivative, but they are, in fact, imitating the spirit of the age. They're not at all countering it. But they do have a moment that's interesting, that is, they're trying to resonate with the age in a very specific sense. And most great art is both universal and particular in some sense. How do you take the classical forms, the traditional forms, and retain the beauty intrinsic to them, and at the same time resonate with the age that seems popularly to be very responsive to this modernist architecture?
Well, again, I don't know, this may seem like a cop-out, but I don't think that you get overly concerned with the self-conscious imitation of that present. If we did, then it would be MTV and so forth in a certain way. And I think, here's just a little example. We built a house in California in the 80s, and it wasn't Norbert Schultz, it was a parallel person of the same generation, Heinrich Klotz, who was a very great friend and supporter. And he came, and he got very nervous when he actually saw it. He'd seen drawings, and they were fine. He saw the house, and it wasn't yet, it was still a postmodern building, but it looked too classical for him. And he said, well, why not just over that arch put a neon tube, and that'll make me feel a lot better. So then that's the sign that we're with it, Madonna, not Venus any longer, or whatever. And so, I don't know if that's really a good answer to what you're saying, but I just don't think we can, because the contemporary deconstructive phase of modernism is so self-conscious, and this perfect person is Peter Eisman for this, because he loves to use all of you as a psychiatrist, and then he goes to his 2 psychiatrists in New York to talk it over, but in a lecture. But there is just this incredible desire for, look at me, I'm suffering. But one thing I do want to say, because I certainly, I don't want to sound like an apologist, but I certainly have a nostalgic nostalgic sense of stasis or happiness with the icons of modernist architecture. To me, it reminds me of my parents, my home. To me, it's just nostalgia, though. So that its revival currently is very odd. But there are many modernisms. The mimetic quality that they did and do now is to impose limits on what of that 70-year tradition of modernist architecture can be canonical, and then what we imitate. They never really tell you they're imitating, but of course, it's a series of vocabularies that are used over and over again, and people are genuinely excited, and they imitate that. But I think the one thing to be said that really is important is that in their minds, if we could try to get into it in 1920, just after the First World War, devastation or ghettos or filth, problems of disease. The sanitarian movement is a modernist movement in the 1920s, trying to cleanse all this business, the cleansing power of modernism, had a direct response to certain social and health problems, the efforts to create another aspect of modernism and zoning of cities, to take the factories out and the people living elsewhere and so forth, is another separating quality of modernism that was reacting to pollution and so forth. So, there are understandable reasons or motivations for the development of this abstraction which was happening throughout the arts, but also that its consequences or its desire to create sort of a socialist perfect world as well as another aspect. Anyway, sorry to go on.
It's clear that the other session is already lining up for lunch, so I think we'll have to close here, but I'm sure there's time for more questions.